Okay, good afternoon. Welcome everybody to this event of the Explorers of the International Federation for Public History. Today we have two very special guests and they will talk about imperialism and disease in Egypt. I'm going to introduce them to you. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Christopher Rose. I'm very happy he's here because he was one of my classmates, so it's very special for me for him being here. Chris is a social historian of medicine, focusing on the 19th and 20th century Middle East. He has taught in the School of Behavioral and Social Sciences and at St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas. He has also taught in the Department of History and the Department of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Prior to pursuing his doctorate, he was Director of Outreach and Public Programming at the University of Texas Center for Middle Eastern Studies. An active public historian, he founded the podcast 15-Minute History and served as co-host for 8 years. He's also a past president of the Middle East Outreach Council. And we also have with us Professor Joseph Stanek. Thank you very much for being here. Professor Stanek is an adjunct professor at Anne Arundel Community College, Arnold, MD. Since 2009, he has served in the college's Homeland Security Criminal Justice Institute, where he teaches the history of the Middle East. Professor Stanek is a frequent traveler to the region and is actively involved with the Middle East Outreach Council and the Model Arab League program, which is sponsored by the National Council of the U.S. Arab Relations. He's the author of the book El Dorado Canyon, Reagan's Under the Clear War with Gaddafi, and co-author with Joseph Abul Enian, I am sorry about the pronunciation, Enian, of Middle East 101, a beginner's guide for deployers, travelers, and concerned citizens. So with no more delay, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Jimena. Thank you for hosting us in this program. And Chris, it's great to be with you in this conversation. And
it's always fun to talk with you, Joe. That's one of the reasons why I asked you to do this with me.
Absolutely. And I've had a few little tastes of what's in store for us today, and it's most interesting, the work you've been doing. So congratulations on that. But let's start off by telling us why is the history of medicine and disease so important? Why we should take that for consideration?
Well, so yeah, this is a great question, and it's actually kind of one of the soapboxes I get on these days, is making the case as to why medical history is important. I mean, there's a couple of reasons. One of which is, we're talking right now in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. I am in Texas, where our governor yesterday lifted all of the restrictions, and now there's a fight between the governor's office and various counties around the state about whether or not mask restrictions can still remain in place. So, in one hand, studying the history of disease and health and how people thought of disease and how it's been treated, and the progression of pandemics is interesting because it has practical applications. In times like this, when COVID first happened, there was a lot of question. There were a lot of people who immediately turned to the history of the Spanish flu pandemic, which actually is something I know a little bit about. But another reason is that particularly when you're working on the history of parts of the world where historically literacy rates were low. I work on Egypt, and well into the 20th century, the illiteracy rate in Egypt was almost 90%, especially through the period I specialize on, which is the First World War. And so one of the questions becomes well, how can we tell the history of people who could not leave written records of their own? Okay. And we've gone through a number of phases of this, in the historical record. In the 70s, Marxist theory was really important, and then we had, the rise of the subaltern schools and various different methods. But one of the things that particularly in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, and now moving into the Middle East, historians have discovered is that during periods of epidemic diseases, when people got very sick, or were dying in massive numbers, they tended to, you get a sense of uh, that they considered the government responsible for their health. They demanded services. They reported their suffering, and so this is one of those moments where when they actually speak for themselves, and
Mhm.
people write down what they're saying. So you get a sense of the pressures that normal people, everyday people like I tell my students, people like us, people who weren't kings and queens and governors, um, were thinking, were feeling, what was important to them, because these are the moments when what they normally had to grin and put up with, grin and bear, if you will, became intolerable. And so you can sort of read into history that way. And so that's one of the reasons why it fills in the gaps of what the traditional methods of social and political history have not been able to answer so far. So it's like adding another layer to our understanding. It gives us a richer understanding of what the social and political situations were like in history before reading and writing became common.
Okay, very good, excellent. No, I can attest to your work on the Spanish flu in Egypt during the World War I and immediately after era. But you focus a lot on cholera in the 19th
Correct.
century, especially in the British Empire. Why is cholera an important to study?
Cholera was the terror of the 19th century world. So I'm going to screw up her name. It's Frances Burnett. But she wrote The Secret Garden. Frances Hodgson Burnett, I believe, is her name. And The Secret Garden is a children's story. They turned it into a Broadway musical about 25 years ago. And it begins with a little girl whose parents are English colonists in India, I think in the civil service or whatnot. And she's put to bed, and the parents throw a dinner party, and in the morning, everyone in the house except the little girl has died of cholera.
Mm.
Um, and the thing I tell my students that story, and then one of the things I point out almost immediately is that's not poetic license. Cholera could kill that quickly.
Mhm.
So it was until the 1850s, no one knew where it came from. No one knew how or when I say no one knew where it came from, they didn't understand how it was contracted. So it just seemed to come from nowhere. It killed massive numbers of people, and it did so in an incredibly gruesome way. Victims essentially expel all of the fluids from their body through whichever passageway happens to be closest to the source of irritation. But it was horrible to watch. It was horrible to experience. And it had extremely high mortality rates. So basically, if you began exhibiting symptoms of cholera, it was a death sentence. So people were terrified of this disease. And uh, the tack onto this, and what cholera has to do with imperialism, is that cholera came from India, which of course was newly under mostly British control by the time of the first outbreak in 1817. The French presence had mostly gone away. There were still some couple of Portuguese ports. Um, but the spread outward from India to other parts of the world, therefore, were worrying to imperial officials because it meant that cholera was being transmitted with British ships, with British and Indian troops who were being moved from place to place, and that the imperial project was somehow responsible for actually spreading the disease. And so this is the other reason that it was so terrifying. Um, there are a couple of theories about about whether cholera was new. Because it had not been seen in this level of lethality before the 1817 outbreak, which was centered in Bengal around the city of Calcutta, which at the time was the British capital of India, was the capital of British India. Let me rephrase that. And so there's one theory that it was a very local disease, local to a specific subregion in India. And because it killed so quickly, and transportation was slow, it literally was not possible to move the virus out of this particular area. And then there's another that it was a new mutation that was substantially more lethal than anything that had happened before. I tend toward the second one, just because I think that if there had been like the Valley of Death, where, a disease this lethal had existed, somebody would have commented on it. The British scientists who were in India, who were sort of tracking the spread of the disease, they were really very derogatory toward their Indian counterparts. India has an extremely long history of producing medical texts. I mean, we're talking into the thousands BC, that we have texts written in Sanskrit detailing, early ideas on anatomy and the circulatory system and the digestive system and whatnot. But basically, in the 19th century, with the sort of rise of imperialism, it was decided that European scientists could not trust the observations of Indian doctors. And so they did one of those things that they teach historians of medicine not to do, which is something called paleopathology, which is where you look at a source and it's like, well, the symptoms described here seem to match this disease, and this is a bad idea because you really can't do it without tissue samples. And so they'd say, well, we see people vomiting all the time, so that must have been cholera. So it's just that the Indian doctors didn't understand how serious it was, or they didn't care. And this all went hand in hand with imperial attitudes of the 19th century. So to review, was cholera so interesting? It was new, it was lethal until the 1850s. There was no firm understanding of how it spread, and also was the origin in India. So in other words, by colonizing India, Britain had opened a Pandora's box.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Chris, following up on what you've already said about, touched on with imperialism, as far as the issue of the great empires and disease, why were the imperial powers so concerned about the spread of diseases?
Well, so this is a period of increased global interconnectivity. Transportation was beginning to get faster. And to be perfect, in all honesty, and I think this is one of those things that we don't talk enough about, particularly at the K-12 level, is the concept that colonies are supposed to be profitable. And if everything, stop me if this starts to sound familiar in COVID times, where everything's been operating under capacity or been closed for the last year, right? But is that one of the things that was very concerning is, remember, until the rebellion of the 1840s.
Yeah, in mutiny.
We're not supposed to call it the mutiny anymore.
But, what is it now?
It's the Great Indian Rebellion or the Great Indian Uprising.
Okay.
But
that's what it was.
But is that India wasn't under the control of the crown; it was under the control of a private company.
That's right.
A private company that sold shares, a private company whose job was to maintain profit. And so one of the things that kills profits faster than anything else is, as we've seen, I'm looking out my office window right here, and right outside the office window is the flight path of the Boston airport, which used to be super busy. Now it's 1 or 2 an hour. Is closing ports to ships because they have disease on board kills your profit. It kills your bottom line. right? And so if you think of empires as massive economic machines that are dependent on colonial production of raw materials in order to make the factories back home function, the factories can't function if they're not getting the raw materials. And if something as awful as cholera is being transmitted along those trade routes, it's incredibly threatening for profit. The other thing is that particularly post Edward Jenner, once he discovered the smallpox vaccine, the cowpox based smallpox vaccine, which was right at the beginning of the 19th century, comes a greater awareness that a modern nation state in the European model should look after the health of its citizens.
Mhm.
That the government should, as part of the social contract with its people, be protecting them body and soul. And so this is and so, you know, the having a new and unexplained disease is another one of those things that prevents the government from being able to do so. So when cholera hits Western Europe in the 1830s, it hits Paris in 1831-32, and then London 32-33. And you have, you know, tens of thousands of people succumbing to this illness. You have, and again, very familiar now to us in the time of COVID. You have the double whammy of people criticizing the government for not doing enough to protect people from this scourge, and people who are criticizing the public health authority for overstepping its bounds by requiring, for example, sick people to report to hospital. Hospitals were very unpopular at this time because, you know, there was a sort of old style barracks. People were treated in public, or public, you know, but they weren't in a private room. They were frequently dirty. You know, anybody who was of means had a doctor come to the house. And they would usually, cholera hospitals were essentially where people were sent to die. You know, and so you had this dichotomy where you're not doing enough, but you're doing too much. And so, but all of these measures cost money. And in fact, I can show you some things. Sorry, I did the wrong. I did it wrong. Hang on. Okay. So let me show you this. Okay. Joe, which monitor of mine are you seeing? Are you seeing the big cartoon or
I see two cartoons side by side. Cholera, the 19th
okay.
century bogeyman, and Cholera, the invader.
Okay. Excuse me while I figure out a system I'm not familiar with.
Okay, there you go. You've got one big.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, let's just go with this one. Is this cartoon from Britain in around the time of the first epidemic in 1832? Is it's hard to see it, but basically you have a blue skeleton in the center of the panel. Cholera was known as the blue disease because as part of the rapid dehydration, patients often turned purplish blue shortly before they expired. If you look closely at the high resolution, unfortunately, I can't share that with you because of the screen sharing limitations. You'll actually see that what it is it's a skull painted blue. He has broom handle legs. And the men behind him are members of the public health who are collecting money for quote unquote protecting people from cholera. So essentially, what the cartoon is saying is that the public health system is milking the threat of cholera for its own financial gain. So, you know, it's the sort of same legends and conspiracy theories that we saw with, for example, COVID. I even had students who repeated back to me that, you know, hospitals get paid $50,000 for every COVID death they report, even though that was debunked really early on. But, you know, it caught on was this idea that the disease isn't as threatening as the people who are trying to protect you from it.
Yeah.
So that's another aspect of this. Okay, I'll stop the share here. So,
Okay.
okay. Yeah. Come the 1850s, and I think everybody knows this. My students had a little chant going because every time I would mention the physician John Snow, they would respond, "Not the king in the north." But sorry for those of you who've seen Game of Thrones, and if you haven't, don't start now. John Snow was a physician in London, and he is the one who famously created a scattergraph of all of the outbreaks in a particular London neighborhood and was able to trace the infection to water. And so it was one particular water pump that was producing tainted water, and from this people were contracting the disease. And so the London municipality brought in clean water for people to start drinking, and the illness was reduced. And once again, this leads to controversy because after it's tried in a few other places, and they realized that there was a connection between tainted water and the spread of cholera, they start installing modern sewer lines. Now remember, this is the mid-1850s, okay? So when I'm saying this, you need to also understand that simultaneously in India, they are roundly excoriating the local population for not doing this. That, you know, the local people are living unsanitary lives. They're drinking out of retaining pools that, you know, latrines are leaking into. And they've literally just figured this out at home. And then in the imperial context, they're using it as justification for the continuance of the imperial mission based on the understanding that, and I will use this in finger quotes, but quote, Oriental people do not understand health. They do not understand hygiene. They do not understand how to prevent diseases from spreading, even though this knowledge was not settled at home in Europe either. But this complete disconnect, if not rank hypocrisy, quite frankly, doesn't stop them from doing this. The last cholera outbreak in England is in 1866. And at the same time, literally 2 years before that, in 1864, London had basically in writing, but repudiated the sanitary commissioner in India for sending a report saying that there had been this big religious festival in North India at the headwaters of the Ganges. It happens every 10 years. That cholera had been detected on some of the pilgrims returning home, that they'd been detained, they'd been quarantined, they'd been put up in camps. And he was very self-congratulatory in this report about how this, you know, really spared the subcontinent, that, you know, comparatively speaking, very few people died, very few people got sick, and all London was concerned about was the price tag of 40,000 rupees. And so the next report that comes out in 1867 says, quarantine is useless. Cholera is going to spread regardless of whether we try to do anything about it or not. So, you know, we'll just have to deal with it as it comes and sequester patients, but we're not going to use quarantines anymore. And for a little while in the 1850s and 60s, the British attempted to convince the rest of the world that the cholera did not actually come from India, but it actually came from the Hijaz. Specifically, it came from Mecca and was being transmitted around the world by pilgrims returning from the Hajj. And nobody else was quite buying this. Starting in 1851, there were a series of international sanitary conventions. The first two were in Paris and the third in Istanbul in 1866, where nations that were maritime trading powers met to come up with a common series of protocols and agreements about what they were going to do to prevent the spread of disease into their ports along shipping lines. And what's interesting is that by this point, the British, with an eye for the bottom dollar, have said, well, look, cholera is already in India. Cholera is already in Europe. It's hit Europe repeatedly. It's in Egypt. It's in Japan. It's in Russia. It's in Persia. So it's endemic in all of these places. Endemic meaning that it occurs locally in the environment. So there's no actual point to suspending shipping because all you're doing is introducing, at best, you're introducing a virus into an environment where it's already found. And this was called the anti-contagionist stand. And the interesting thing about it is that scientists in Britain knew full well that wasn't true, but they were overridden by the party in power and the India office, which basically was concerned about keeping India profitable. In 1866, at the International Conference in Istanbul, there was unanimous agreement that India was the source of cholera geographically, and that quarantining ships from India at the time of outbreak was the best way to deal with the measure. The only votes against this, and interestingly enough, it always falls this way, is Britain and Austria. And I'll be perfectly honest with you, I think Austria had 12 miles of coastline at this point, so I'm not even sure what they were doing there. But Austria always voted with England in support of anti-contagionism, but everybody else, and by 1866, the Ottomans had been there from the beginning, the Iranians were there. You had a lot of countries involved in this who were basically agreeing that in the event of cholera, they were going to close their ports to British ships.
Okay. Very good. Chris, that's most fascinating. Now let's move to Egypt. What happened? The British, of course, take control of Egypt in 1882.
Yes.
What happened there, as far as cholera and British controlled Egypt?
Okay, this is an excellent question. So the first thing to understand about British control of Egypt is that it happened up until the 1870s. Egypt was kind of the darling of the Mediterranean. It was a Muslim North African country that had developed rapidly over the course of the 19th century. Now, I am painting with very broad strokes. So those of you in the audience who are Egyptian historians, please don't crucify me because I'm oversimplifying here. We only have so much, so long. But arguably by the 1850s, Egypt had the strongest public health system in the Eastern Mediterranean. Smallpox vaccination was mandated from the end of the 1830s, and even into the 1880s, they had one of the highest vaccination rates outside of Europe. In fact, I think they had one of the highest vaccinations, even counting Europe. I had a professor actually when I was studying abroad in Egypt who said, in 1860, or 1870, let's say 1870, if somebody had asked you to place a bet on who was going to be the major world power of the 20th century, Japan or Egypt, no one in their right mind would have picked Japan. And the story of why that's not the case is actually the story of British imperialism. But the reason the British took over was because Egypt became financially insolvent. in debt to British and French banks. And they defaulted on the loans, and the government became very compliant. Britain basically took over the financial administration of the country in the late 1870s. And then the military became very upset with what they saw as the Ottoman viceroy's acquiescence to foreign domination. And there was a military uprising in the winter of 1881 and 1882, and then the British came in militarily and occupied the country. Now, the reason why this is particularly telling is that this becomes Egypt becomes an interesting colonial laboratory, because Egypt itself is a colonial power. It's occupying Sudan and actually what is now northern Uganda, the region called Equatoriana.
Yeah.
And it has at times over the course of the 19th century occupied part of Hijaz and what is now the center of Saudi Arabia, Crete, other and other areas in the region. So Egypt is in this weird position where it is both colonizer and colonized at the same time. And the Egyptian government has protocols in place to deal with cholera that are then overwhelmed or then rewritten when the British come in. Because trade is so important, and especially with the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, the Suez Canal port city of Port Said, as well as Alexandria, are both the health commissions are both international. So you have Austrians and French and Germans and Italians and Greeks and British and Egyptian medical officials all making decisions about how what protocols will be in place, in force, and which will not. And the reason why this is all important is because come 1883, in late June of 1883, cholera appears in the Nile Delta. And what you have is a situation in which the British attempt to import wholesale the models that they use to control cholera from India, which clashes horribly with local sensibilities about disease and dying, and creates an incredible amount of social tension. There are protests, and the epidemic is mismanaged so badly that by the fall, over 6 months, 50,000 people die. And the population of the country at this point is around 8 million. So it's, that's a lot of people in a population that's small. And it really was just sort of the big litmus test, the early litmus test for the British occupation. So let me pull up my notes here just real fast to get through it, to make sure I hit all my major points. So let me try to work this in. So cholera appears on June 25th. And there are a couple of suspect cases. Telegrams are sent to Alexandria and Cairo. Members of the Central Health Authority come out. They realize that it is, in fact, cholera. And the first thing that happens, of course, is the news gets out and ports around the Mediterranean begin closing to ships that have passed through the Suez Canal. This is, of course, the lifeblood to and from India, right? We're just getting into the steam era. Most ships are some sort of hybrid or coal. So normally they call at Port Said or Damietta or Cyprus, go through the canal, and then call again at Aden, which is down in Yemen. But you can't make the trip from India to Europe without stopping.
Yeah.
And if you take Egypt out of the equation, then you've got to go around the Cape of Good Hope, which adds 6 weeks to the trip. And it's just a bad idea all around. So the British immediately try to, first off, disassociate the outbreak that appears in Egypt in late June from the one that appeared in Bombay in May. To say that they're completely unrelated and that there is no way that the disease was transmitted from India to Egypt. So that's step one. Step two is that the British Surgeon General, Sir Geyer Hunter, announces that he is going to Egypt to oversee the investigation into the disease's origins. And he lands in Alexandria early July, and they throw a party for him at the consulate where several local notable officials are there. And a number of them report later that he informs a lot of people as the wine and sherry start flowing, that he has already determined that the cause of the disease is going to be found locally, so that they can assure the world that ships passing through Egypt that say go on to Cyprus or call it Beirut instead of Alexandria will be safe. Because again, the whole concern here is about protection of the trade to and from India. The other thing they do that is completely a complete 180 from their measures in India is they enforce quarantine in the Nile Delta. That prevents people from moving in and out of the quarantine. It is backed up by soldiers. And what is difficult about this is that the medical staff from the School of Medicine in Cairo was sent to the Delta to deal with the pandemic or the outbreak, and they get trapped in the quarantine. So now there are no doctors to deal with the cholera anywhere else, and they have to get people coming in from India. And apparently the quarantine was so bad that they started running out of food. Like they weren't even allowing food shipments into those areas. As the disease, by the way, begins to spread outside, because the disease is spread in water, which they know, you can quarantine the area, but if you can't separate the water flow, it's completely ineffective.
Right.
And so it is, to quote the late Margaret Thatcher, a higgledy-piggledy mess. The other thing is that you have this continued dialogue in the documentation that's being produced at the consulate, and I've read through a bunch of the stuff that's now in the British archives, that continues to uphold this understanding that the Oriental does not understand hygiene. There is also, I would really love to get into some of the materials that were used to train people that went into the colonial service, because there is this apocryphal hadith of the Prophet Muhammad. For those of you who don't do Islamic history, this is one of the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, but it dates from at least 2 centuries after his lifetime. So it's not considered reliable, and I have only ever run across it in colonial sources uttered by colonial officials. But the hadith says that anybody who dies of the plague will receive the same reward in the afterlife as somebody who dies in a military jihad. And so you see this, I'm gonna pull up a document here, and I apologize. It is not the easiest thing to read, but it sort of illustrates the points. Yes, I am sharing Microsoft PowerPoint. Thank you for telling me that. Let me see if I can get this any bigger. Is this section right here in the middle. In other words, the value for life is less vehement and potent in the Oriental. Remember, this is based on the French understanding of Oriental, which basically means everything to the East, including the Middle East. While the belief in a discernible destiny is stronger, the value for life is overwhelmingly predominant in the European. Well, the belief in a destiny that in any sense overrules human action is therefore more theoretic than practical. This is such a good line here. The Oriental is less terrified by the prospect of death and more profoundly impressed by the impossibility of escaping it when the time comes. This trope of the fatalistic Muslim has been around since the Black Death.
Yeah.
In other words, the idea that when faced with a disease for which there is no known treatment or cure, mind you, the Muslims don't do, I'm not actually sure what it is they're supposed to do, but they're not doing it, okay? Somehow they're just acquiescing and accepting that they're going to die, and they basically lay down in the middle of the street. Or this is the constant European trope, whereas the European, fears premature death, and will fight, to stay alive, blah, blah, blah. And by the way, this was originally in a London newspaper, and it was rerun in the New York Times. Now, let me show you an image I found of the same pandemic in 1883. This is an engraving of people in Cairo boarding on boats to flee the city ahead of the progression of the cholera. And as I said, very tongue-in-cheek when I gave this talk last summer to another group, I said, can't you just see how excited for martyrdom they are? Don't they look really happy about impending death? I mean, this interpretation just flies in the face of all common sense, right? 40,000 people fled Cairo in the span of a week. Cairo at the time was only about 350,000 people total. As news reports every single day would detail, they're coming, it's coming, it's coming, this village has been infected, there are suspect cases here. People knew that the disease was coming, and in fact, the exodus from Cairo probably contributed to the disease spreading more quickly into Upper Egypt, because most of them went south because the disease was coming from the north, from the Mediterranean.
Chris, could I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Did the British try and stop this movement? People fleeing Cairo?
They did not. At that point, they were more concerned with trying to prevent people from the infected areas from coming in. But it turned out that people were walking through fields in the middle of the night in order to get around the quarantine. Right. So this is the other thing: is the quarantines were ineffective because they weren't well managed. But the other thing is that public health then proceeds to switch into what I would say is a proactive mode. And they start doing things like clearing out poor neighborhoods in the big cities. Tanta in the Nile Delta was one of them. I see Stephanie Boyle is in the audience, and this is her specialty. But also is in Mansoura, which is another Delta city, in Cairo, in the city of Giza, and in a couple of other places, they start burning neighborhoods where the houses are considered filthy. This is the other thing, is that with the identity or the identification of cholera coming from tainted water, is the British then begin assigning social worth to people who contract it on the notion that their lifestyles are contributing to it. Now, mind you, they're not providing clean drinking water in the afflicted neighborhoods, right? So they know what causes it, but basically there are constant references in the documentation to people living in filth. And remember, filth is an organic substance. So I had to remind my students, this is not a synonym for they live in dirty houses. What the British are saying is that they live in shit. Okay, and that's what filth means. Filth is not a nice word in the 19th century. The other thing, so another thing that they do is they begin entering private homes where they have heard through their informants that people have cholera, that there is a patient, and they will forcibly remove them to the hospital. Now, remember, the incubation period of cholera is very short, and so usually by the time word gets to the public health, they get an ambulance, they send it out to the place, they load the person up, they take them to the hospital. Hospitals are not open to the family. Most of the time, the patient then proceeds to expire rather quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So then the rumor gets put about that hospitals are places that the British are liquidating Egyptians. Which leads to the next conspiracy theory. Again, this all starts to ring familiar in the modern era, which is that the British introduced cholera to Egypt on purpose in order to control the country more effectively by killing a bunch of people. And there are riots in front of hospitals because early on, the bodies of the victims would be either buried in mass graves or cremated, and cremation is not acceptable to either Muslims or to Coptic Christians. So basically, now you've offended everybody because the bodies you can't give last rites for the dead, and it is just this total. I know the word I want to use. I will not use it in a public presentation. What we have here is a massive failure to communicate, with this insistence by the British that spending money on public health in Egypt to introduce modern sewer lines to bring in drinking water will have no effect because poor people would rather just die and get their martyr's reward. They say this, actually. And so this is part of the justification for slashing the budget for public health that had been in place since the days of the Ottoman viceroys. And they don't spend any money on it, and then consequently, the situation, the health situation is bad. It's starting to run a little bit out of steam here. So the last thing I want to say is, and this is sort of the more optimistic thing, is that the other team that comes out to Egypt to work on cholera is the team of Robert Koch, who, working in Alexandria during this epidemic, identifies what he calls Vibrio comma, because it looks like a comma, but it's the causal agent of cholera. And it was only the second one after typhoid that had actually been identified, and that had just been a couple of years earlier. And so with this knowledge, which, by the way, when Koch's report comes out, the British Surgeon General goes nuts, and just there are letters and columns in the Lancet and the British Medical Journal about Koch is a nut job. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's made this up to discredit the British government. And then when the scientific community comes on board and says, no, this is clearly what is causing this illness, Hunter, he digs in, but at one point in about 1885, there's an editorial in the Lancet that basically says, Surgeon General Hunter, it's time to give it up. You're barking mad, and everyone knows you're just trying to keep up the front. So that's actually what changes everything. So there's another outbreak in 1885, and then introduced clean drinking water and provisions that in the case of an outbreak of typhus or cholera or any other waterborne diseases, they will bring in fresh drinking water to poor neighborhoods. And so when cholera hits again in the 1890s, the death toll goes way down to, a couple thousand as opposed to 50,000, in this particular outbreak. But one of the things that's really interesting about this is that, and I'll just sort of use this to wrap up my prepared remarks, and then we can go to questions, is that one of the things that's really interesting about this whole episode to me is that this provides us with several understandings. Number one, we get a sense of how the early British occupation really impacts the lives of normal people, right? We know what happens to the political elites. We know what happened because they tell us. We know what happens to, the merchant class because they tell us. But what's the average reaction of the rank and file, of the 90% of people who did not leave records? And so we get a sense that they really wanted the British to just leave them be, and particularly when it came to direct interventions, going into homes without invitation to pull out people who were sick. They were very mad about that. They were very mad about being excluded from hospitals. They were very mad about not being given bodies back so that they could be given a proper burial and send off. And so you get a sense that these are things that these were too far. So you get a sense of what was still socially important, even in this rapidly changing milieu of Egyptian society in the late 19th century. And so the other thing, of course, is that you get a glimpse into this sort of things that were very important to the imperial power. Especially, this is before Cromer came in. Cromer doesn't come in until late 1883. So, they kind of stumbled a little bit and had to make amends. But even then, you don't see improvement in public health expenditures until after Cromer leaves in 1905. And so what's fascinating from my perspective is that the situation in terms of the number of the hospital bed per capita, clinics, doctors, trained professionals in Egypt on the eve of World War I is really only back to where it was in about 1870. So instead of making the country better, they actually reduced the quality of life overall.
Chris, could you touch on one more thing? I know
Yes.
I know you've done an outstanding job here, but touch on one more thing, that litmus test factor, that the British
Yes.
see the British see cholera as an indication that the British and other subdued people are not ready for independence yet.
Yeah. So sanitation is one of the litmus tests. So as anybody who even works in the modern period will know, modernity is I use the term fuzzy word when I'm teaching, but it is one of those words of imprecise definition, whose definition can be manipulated at will in order to sort of give a precise meaning to one party while being vague to the other. And so health and hygiene was one of these markers of modernity that kept shifting in late 19th century Egypt and early 20th century. Also in India, also in other colonial settings, but basically it was a benchmark that the colony could never meet. And in fact, at the time of the invasion of 1882, Parliament did not want another colony. They didn't want Egypt. The people occupying Egypt had different ideas, of course. The Colonial Office thought it was too valuable to leave in the hands of people like, the Egyptians. And so you can see that by the end of the epidemic, their correspondence back to London is basically saying, we're going to have to stay here for a while because, we have to make the situation better.
Creative this.
And they're using it as justification for continuing the colonial mission.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Chris, I know you've been doing a lot of research, a lot of work, a lot of writing. So we all want to wish you the best of luck in all your upcoming articles and other writing projects. And I know you're always asking for feedback or inputs. How can people contact you if they wanted to give you some feedback?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter. So my website is my full name, ChristopherSRose.com. And that is probably the easiest way to reach me. My Twitter is linked right there at the bottom page. And so yeah, I've 3 pieces coming out in the next few months. So I've got an article on the Spanish flu in Egypt, which will be out in the next issue of the Journal of World History. I've got a piece on food and disease during World War I coming out in an edited volume later in the summer. And then a piece on basically the importance of the social history of medicine for expanding our knowledge of Middle Eastern history, which will be out in History Compass soon.
Okay.
And I'll link all of those on my website.
Okay. Chris, as an historian, I love the way you connect the disease, the British attempts to abate it, and the rise of the nationalist movement in Egypt. It is really tremendous.
And I think so historians of the nationalist movement disagree with me, but I think this is one of because the thing is in 1919 there's this massive revolution, and people literally you have peasants coming out of the fields to participate. And one of my points is, well, they've been starving and dying for 5 years, and they don't quite go out to celebrate the nationalist cause so much as they start cutting train lines and telegraph lines. It's not like they want to be part of the nation. It seems like they want the nation to go away and leave them alone. But this national myth in Egypt is everywhere else in the world.
Okay.
George Washington never told a lie. That sort of thing. It's gone away, but I think it does give us a lot of new lenses into what was going on.
Okay, very good. Jimena?
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you, Chris, a lot. I have known you for a long time, but have never take the time to know a lot in detail about your work, and I'm glad I did. It's very interesting. Thank you very much. You have 3 questions so far. The first one is it's more a request. Simeon wants to know if you can share your PowerPoint with him. He gave me his email. I can share it to you later. And then there's a question from Khaled. He's asking you, did the Sanskrit text in India have information about the hospitals and information about medicine? And then there's another question. You want me to read it first, or you answer this one and then the other one?
Let's take them one at a time.
Okay.
So yeah, there are a number of studies of traditional Indian medicine and the history of medicine in the subcontinent. I actually, in comparison to the Middle East, it's far more developed than the historiography we have about pre-modern medicine in the Islamic world and in the Middle East. Yeah, basically, if I know this is one of those things that as professional historians are not supposed to say, I'm going to say it anyway. If you go to Wikipedia and you look for history of medicine in India, it has a wonderfully comprehensive listing of all of those old Sanskrit texts. And in fact, a lot of them, and again, this is where the South Asianists have us beat, totally. A lot of them have been put online in the original, like it's open source, and it's out there for people to see. So yeah, you can, a lot of the medicine was herbal. So Indian medicine was the Ayurvedic system is much more comprehensive than the Galenic medicine, which has the 4 humors. This is incorporated into traditional Islamic medicine. Ayurvedic medicine, it takes into account a lot more things, and it's much more holistic. So, and in fact, this is again one of those interesting shifts that happens around the time, around the 19th century. The first Europeans who went out to India sought treatment from local doctors on the assumption that um, diseases that you found in different parts of the world could be treated by people who lived in, you know, it's not rocket science here. But later on, with the, especially post-French Revolution, the advent of European pathological anatomical medicine, what we usually call modern medicine now, these ideas were discredited. But yeah, a lot of those texts are online, and they're really, really fascinating. I would I would love to have a few months to sit down and read through them, because they're actually surprisingly comprehensive. Indian and Chinese medicine, you know, if you wanted to get decent treatment, you know, 1,000 years ago, you did not go to Europe. You know, you went to Persia, or you went to India, or you went to China, and it's really fascinating stuff.
Okay, very good.
Okay, so now we have a question from Grace. She says, this was mentioned briefly before, people spreading false information, and I wanted to know if there were any major incidents in the past, and even today, how should people handle information during an outbreak?
You can't stop rumor. It is one of the most powerful things in the world. You know, and a lot of it, you know, and it's interesting you raised that question, because I've thought about this a lot lately. You know, I've thought about this a lot lately. I'm going to finish one thought before I move to the next one. Sorry. Is that there are so many parallels with the world we live in now. Because one of the issues that really plays into this is how well you trust the authorities or the people who are giving you information, right? So in the United States in particular, there was a lot of questioning of the official narrative around COVID, because officialdom was questioning the narrative around COVID, or proposing alternate narratives around COVID, which is definitely, you know, a problem. In the, you know, during the 83 outbreak of cholera, you know, the British were new arrivals. Nobody particularly wanted them there. And they were doing things that people didn't understand, and they didn't trust them. So even when they would put out information, you know, it wasn't accepted, it wasn't trusted. And so this is, again, one of those things that you can start sussing out. But you know, how does one handle information? You know, I don't work on the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu fell into my lap when I was working on health in Egypt during World War I. And even here in the United States, you had anti-mask leagues. There was a very active one in San Francisco, because this is immediately post World War I, and so you had, for example, the use of militaristic language. You know, soldier, you masked up in the trenches, you can mask up again. You know, sort of appealing to, you know, the masculine call for duty that had, you know, gone into recruiting troops. And because face masks, which were widely used during the Spanish flu epidemic, were seen as feminine. And so, you know, and so it's interesting that, you know, we did not attempt to use that sort of language this time. We have not had, well, I mean, we're still involved in a military conflict, but, you know, not quite at that level. So the idea of, you know, sacrifice, you know, and whatnot doesn't quite have the same resonance. You know, if COVID had hit, you know, a couple years after 9/11, that might be different, right? But so, you know, the idea of being able to give information out. The other thing is that because people were so used to not having cures for these things, remember, this prior to antibiotics didn't really come, broad spectrum antibiotics didn't really come on the market until after World War II. So a lot of these diseases were basically care was therapeutic and palliative, but curative was not. If you caught cholera, you were going to die. You know, if you caught typhoid, you might recover. Malaria was something people live with, but you know, the death rates from these things were much higher. And so there was also just less interest in seeking out advice from doctors because, you know, half the time it didn't work. So, you know, it's not like now where it's like, well, I can tell you how, you know, far down my susceptibility to COVID will go after I got my vaccination. Um, you know, but that sort of information also just wasn't readily available. Because it has to be readily available, it has to be readily available in a format people can understand. And when you're in a place where there's 90% illiteracy, that's also hard, you know. So, but yeah, the spread of false information in the absence of trustworthy information, people then go to people they know and trust for information without applying that critical lens.
That's right. That's a
And I
good
think
point.
that's just something that, I mean, let's be perfectly honest here. The Bible begins with this story, right? Of Eve believing the serpents in the garden, you know, and it just goes downhill from there. So,
Okay, thank you, Chris. There's another question from Stephanie Boyle. She wants to know, in what ways can disease inform our understanding of British imperial history in Egypt? What gaps of knowledge do you think that your study can fill?
I don't know, Stephanie. In what ways can she's Stephanie and I are co-editing a volume on the social history of disease in the Middle East, and she also works on 19th century Egypt, but I will attempt to expound on this study. So the one of there are a couple of different answers to this, but particularly with my work on World War One, the civilian narrative is lost. Most histories of Egypt actually just sort of gloss over the war years because that period is very interesting for people who work on nationalism, and not much happened during that period. And so they just tend to go. And then World War One happened, you know, because they deport all the nationalist leaders. So there was an agitation during the war, and then they bring them back. And the agitation starts up again, and then there's an uprising, but they don't really talk about the war. And one of the things, the story of World War One in the Middle East is a story of environmental disaster. The Ottomans slashed and burned their way out of Greater Syria as they retreated. You know, and again, this is one of the stories people don't talk about. The memory of the famine is there that took place, but you know, so and this is a completely different narrative, but I would really like to see it reintroduced into the early history of Jewish settlement in Palestine. Is the fact that the region had been devastated. The Ottomans took crops, what they couldn't take, they burned. They destroyed the infrastructure. And, you know, you have a bunch of European settlers coming in who are willing to pay to rebuild everything. And of course, now, 100 years later, you cannot say things like, oh, yeah, my grandfather sold some land so we could get some money to rebuild our farm, because nobody wants to admit to having done that. Because it becomes so politicized. But, you know, pragmatically speaking, these things probably almost certainly happened. And in Egypt, it's the same way, because the story of British interaction with the Egyptians is about British interaction with Egyptian institutions, most of which they were also running. But also, what is just completely lost is how this affected normal people. So when the British come in and requisition most of the food for military use, for a war that they told the Egyptian people at the beginning was not theirs to fight and they didn't have to worry about, and people start going hungry, you know, this is an important understanding in why the British government, and then when it was replaced by a very complacent nationalist government that kind of rolled over every time the British wanted something from it. And they started turning to other outlets to get their voices heard, such as the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 20s. It lends a whole different idea to this period in history, other than, well, Muslims don't like secular government. It's like, well, they've done a better job, or if they'd given the people things that they wanted, but the British were very unpopular. And so there's a whole range of things that we can learn. And this is one of those avenues in, by looking at, because again, people weren't doing oral history in the countryside. So we have to look for moments when people asked for things themselves. And this is one of those moments when people are asking for things themselves. That they got upset that people took time to write in the press. Well, we went here and people are suffering very badly. It brings a whole new level to life. And up until now, there's only been one article that looked at this, and that was published in 1982. So we're getting back there finally. But there's a whole host of new stuff that's coming out that looks at, even, for example, a colleague, Jennifer Baer, I just put a book out that looks at the Nile. But one of the things she talks about is in the early 20th century, the British created a school of engineering. And so all these people whose families have worked the lands for millennia, know it intimately, know how to irrigate, know what grows where. All of their knowledge is suddenly delegitimized because they don't have a degree. And only people who graduated from this fancy new institution in Cairo are allowed to make decisions about where the canals are going to go. And literally, they just disenfranchise all these people. And they do this with health officials. The Egyptians had a class from 1837. The Egyptians had a class of credentialed women who practiced medicine. This was created by the Ottoman viceroy in response to the gender segregation in Egyptian society. And these women were responsible. If a dead woman was found under mysterious circumstances, found dead in the street or had drowned or something, the autopsy was performed by a hakima, a female medical professional. The British come in 82, and they're like, oh no, women can't be doctors, they're not smart enough. And literally, with a single memo, the new sanitary inspector, British, writes off and says, yep, they're not allowed to practice medicine anymore. They can't supervise autopsies. Modern Egyptian women need to get over this gender separation thing, and they need to see male doctors. And so they undo it, right? And so you can bet there were a lot of women who just didn't see doctors because they didn't want to go to have a man perform a gynecological exam. And so there's all these things in here about how life has changed that you don't get to access without looking at these sorts of things. And so, we're being very creative. There's another professor, she's in Canada, and she's looking at the songs that the laborers would sing while they were digging up the tombs of the pharaohs, because they usually had a lot of double entendres and they had a lot of political critique in them, and she noticed this. She started like, yeah, people really didn't like this guy, and so we have to get inventive with how to reach these people. And so, like I said, I have to tip my hat to our South Asian and Latin American colleagues, because they've really sort of led the forefront on this kind of study. And we're finally starting to pick it up in Middle Eastern history as well.
Thank you, Chris. If nobody else has a question, I have a question.
Okay.
That's okay with, yeah. I'm thinking about the audience of the explorers, Chris, that is not a specialized audience. There are students all over the world, the people who are going to see this video. So I would like you to tell them what drew you to this topic. How did you handle the archives? I mean, why did you decide to study this kind of topic that it's so, like, I mean, it's not common.
It's becoming more common. So, so to be perfectly honest, and I think I've said this indirectly, but I'll say it right out. I'm interested in how ordinary people lived. One of the things I do whenever I teach the Middle East survey class, either section, whether I'm doing the period from the rise of Islam to the Middle Ages or the modern period, is I always make certain to include a section of the class that is not the great man narrative, right? So I want to talk about what was life for us, people who were normal, not the kings, not the queens, not the great generals. What did a normal person living in this time think about all the things that were going on around them? And you can't always answer that question. And I'll tell you, I found this topic by complete accident, and this will get your video some views. I found it by complete accident because I was sitting in the British Archive on an exploratory trip, trying to figure out what in the world I was going to work on, because I knew I wasn't going to be able to go to Egypt because of the security situation. And a packet of pornography fell in my lap. And it turned out to have been sent to the British High Commission. Everyone loves, I love this story. And by the way, it's pornography from the 1910s. So, I mean, if you've been to an art museum and seen, any exposed bosoms, that's far more extreme than what this guy had. But it was an Anglican missionary. Who made a habit of going around to all the bookstalls in Egypt and buying all the filth, as he called it, again, loaded word, and sending it to the High Commission, which is the British consul, the center of British power in Egypt. And look what the soldiers are being exposed to. This is what he said he was concerned about, was the British soldiers in Egypt. And it just sort of led me down the path, because it was in a file that had to do with the health treatment of sex workers, and this led me to the broader question of health, because as you start going through and looking at the numbers, you start to realize that people were very, very hungry. I'm not sure whether I can. I'm still waffling about whether I can say they were starving, but they were deeply malnourished in Egypt during the war, and you watch disease numbers spike. And as I said, they had, for the time, a fairly well-advanced public health system, so a lot of these things have been brought under control. You normally see this sort of spike, but what then I also noticed is the worst epidemic hits 5 months before the uprising. So the Spanish flu hits in October of 1918. And 1% of the population dies in 6 weeks. So 1 out of every 100 people. In 6 weeks. And this is not in a single history of Egypt. It's never mentioned. Nobody even mentions the Spanish flu happened. And I'm like, I mean, correlation doesn't equal causation, but man, that's a lot of deaths. And, especially when one of the questions that historians of early 20th century Egypt keep trying to answer is, why were the peasants so involved in this revolution? Because the peasants were considered an apolitical class. And I'm like, this seems like a pretty convincing explanation to me, or at least partial explanation. And as I said, I gave this, I don't know, I think this is the conference you weren't at, Joe, the one in New Orleans. I gave this paper a couple of years ago, and a number of the prominent historians of the revolution were in the room with me, and they did not like this thesis. So I walked it back to, okay, this is one of the but you know, it's one of those things where it's like a lot of people are getting inventive, and you know, and so I tell people my interest in medicine. I'm not really interested in the virus. I'm interested in what happened when the virus hit. What is the social meaning of a disease? What did people think about it? What did people think about the attempts to control it? You know, and I think the most obvious parallel in recent American history is the HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 80s and 90s, where you know victims are stigmatized, the government is criticized for not doing enough about it, and there is literature on the idea of an epidemic as a social event. It has its own narrative arc. So you can actually, so knowing that nearly all of them follow this narrative stories, if the common description into which an epidemic happens doesn't include them, it could be irregular. It could also mean that no one has looked for those. But people get upset and people protest. And one of the things that this will tell you is Egyptians of the late 19th and early 20th century understood that their government was responsible for their public health. They were responsible for keeping them safe from disease. And that is one of those basic fundamental things that historians of modern Egypt don't really talk about. And so just knowing that basically there was an understanding of what we'd call the social contract, that people expected their government to do things for them, is a really important step, because from that you could start making all sorts of other analyses that really don't have anything to do with medicine, but you can draw from that lessons for other fields of study.
Thank you, Chris. We have time for one more question. If anybody wants to just open the mic and jump in. And if we don't, Chris or Joseph, do you want to add something? Do you have any final remarks?
Joe, do you have any other questions?
No, just that this is one of the, when I'm teaching Middle Eastern history, the British occupation era is one of my favorites, and this is going to add a lot more to it. So I really appreciate it, and I wish you the best of luck in your continued work in this on this subject.
Thanks. Yeah, and for those who teach, you know, 19th century, cholera goes really well with the study of imperialism because it pops up everywhere, and it's spectacular. It's spectacular because people react to it so strongly, and you can really grab onto it. It's sort of like the plague, you know, a couple centuries earlier in the second pandemic, you know, that sort of ends with the outbreak in Marseille. You know, cholera is the 19th century version of that, and I think it's just really, it's very illuminating in many ways. So.
And Chris, I also love the. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you first.
I love the point you made way back that Egypt was at one point Egypt was both a colonizer and colonized. And one thing I wanted to add to some of the conquests they had made was that they drove deep into Anatolia. And
that is correct.
And in an attempt to topple the Sultan.
Yep.
So
yep.
Very interesting history.
Yeah. And for those who are interested in the sub-Saharan or the equatorial Africa angle, Eve Trouch Powell from the University of Pennsylvania has written a couple of great books about that, because there was a lot of Black African slavery in Egypt in the 19th century, and there is a complete cultural block on discussing this. It's one of those things that doesn't go very acknowledged. And so she's done some really fascinating stuff on that. So yeah, I highly recommend her stuff as well.
Okay, very good.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much, Joseph, for accepting this invitation of the International Federation for Public History. I will take a moment to invite you to our next event that's going to be on March 26th with the director of the National Museum of Human Rights of Taiwan. It's going to be like a treat, so I'm going to announce that on Facebook. Everybody's invited, and also I'll take the time to tell you that if anybody wants to have an event like this with with explorers. You just need to email me and we can just figure it out and put it together. So again, thank you very much. I'm very happy that you accepted this, and well, I hope to see you soon.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us.
You bet. Thank you.
Great.
Good show.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Goodbye.